Everyone. Thanks for joining us in our webinar today about addressing the CCPA and GDPR. I have Drew Daniels and Akil Murali from Qubole to discuss about how they have gone and talked to the various folks and internally also dealt with the CCPA and GDPR. Uh, Gentlemen, can you introduce yourself? Drew, starting with you.
Absolutely. I'm Drew Daniels. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Qubole. I'm also responsible for our business intelligence, data analytics, IT, and cloud infrastructure. I've been with Qubole about 4 years, primarily focused on taming the chaos that comes with security, and I'm responsible for security globally at Qubole.
Hi, I'm Akil Murali. I'm Director of Product here at Qubole. My focus is largely around the privacy and security of the platform. And topic I'm going to talk about today, largely around how privacy regulations impact businesses, largely to share some of the perspectives that I've heard from customers. So looking forward to this chat.
Thank you, guys. So as you guys have heard a lot about CCP and GDPR from the customers and your peers, can you share some insight with the audience here? Like, how does the conversation start, where it basically starts to go towards?
Well, I think that, and I've even heard it in our casual conversations, I think the predominant thing that I'm hearing from customers and prospects and people is really, what does this mean to me, and how is this going to affect my business? Because these regulations are complex. I mean, if you look at GDPR, it's 99 different articles, and I think it's something like 275 pages of actual legalese that describes the regulation. I tell them the first thing you need to do is we really need to understand how this is going to apply to your business. I mean, what PII data do you collect? How do you store and process that data? Do you know where all that data is?
Yeah, and I think I agree as well. I think largely, especially when you hear in the news about a data breach, or if you hear in the news about somebody being levied a severe penalty, or you have a new privacy regulation. So earlier this year, CCPA went into effect. So when you have trends like that in 2018, when GDPR went into effect, we saw influx of queries from customers. Oh, what does this mean? What do I need to do? Does it impact me? And then with CCPA now, which is the California's enactment, and we're going to see more of it in the future from other states, we see a constant number of customers ask us about this. So it's something that customers will continue to see. I think that's kind of what I expect. And largely, these regulations are kind of mirrored out of each other. But maybe going back to Drew. So Drew, I know there have been regulations like PII, PCI, and PHI that all talk about data security and things of that nature. Now with CCPA and GDPR, customers are often confused about, okay, now what do I need to do? Is there something new? Am I already compliant? So as a practitioner, how do you see these privacy regulations similar or different from some of these other security requirements that they're currently probably complying with?
Yeah, as you and I have talked, a lot of the regulations in the past have been focused on data security, not necessarily data privacy or the consumer rights that are really wrapped into GDPR and CCPA. They're the core of it. So I think the big challenge now for people like myself and security teams at companies is to understand what is your privacy message, to understand where the data is and how you utilize it, and to make sure that you can put things in place to address the consumer rights that come with these various regulations.
Okay. So Drew, let's dig a little bit deeper into this thing. Like, what are the 3 to 4 key requirements in CCPA which you have dealt as a CISO?
So the key requirements are very similar to GDPR. They're slightly different. There are some overlap. There's some that are not overlapped. But the big things are being able to address the consumer's concerns around their data, that it's up to date, and if a consumer asks you to delete the data, that you delete the data. I think that there are requirements that are built into these regulations that are readily readable online, but the key difference is to really understand how you would address this data. In the economy today, I mean, we're collecting more and more data about people, and we have to be able to address all of the data, just not bits and pieces of it. And transparency is, very important. There's got to be a way that people can have their data erased if they're no longer using the service. In many cases, if it's inaccurate, it's got to be updated. The big thing with CCPA that is different than GDPR, for instance, CCPA is really trying in a lot of the regulations to address the selling or the marketing of consumer data to third parties. So, as people collect more data about you, the individual, that data combined with other sources of data makes, marketing to the person a lot better, a lot easier, a lot more targeted. CCPA really addresses the fact that you have to give the customer the opportunity to opt out of being marketed to or the data being sold to another third party.
Okay. So as I think through this, like it's more about the customer having a right to opt out of, like, okay, the company able to share the data with the third parties. What are
for commercial purposes,
For
to
commercial
sell the
purposes.
data to market to them? Yeah.
Okay, got it. So what are the financial consequences or any other consequences if people don't follow these specific guidelines, like the example you gave right now,
Right.
on the companies?
I mean, I think that's really important, and in my job as CISO, Chief Security Officer, that's one of the things that I have to look at the most is, what is the risk of, an enforcement action where a violation could happen, and in GDPR, it's extremely severe. It is 4% of your annualized sales, not your net revenue, or $20 million, which is, a significant enforcement action. With CCPA, it's a little bit smaller, or so it appears. It's $2,500 for an unintentional violation and $3,500 for an intentional violation. But every violation is every record that you have about a consumer. So if you have millions of records about consumers, it could still really affect the bottom line. And that's one of the things that I have to spend time communicating to the rest of our executive staff and to the whole company, that these enforcement actions can be very impactful to our day-to-day business if we don't follow these regulations.
Yeah, and if I can add a use case here. So if you heard the news, I think just the nature of and severity of penalties, as Drew's talking about, is consequential to most businesses, right? We talked about 4% of your annual turnover. So if you just take an example of the fines before GDPR, there's a pre-GDPR age and the post-GDPR age. Pre-GDPR, the biggest fine was around 800,000 or so US dollars levied at Equifax. So there was no breach that cost business more than $1 million. So $1 million for a large business, maybe something is like a slap on the wrist in some way and people can manage. But since then, the year after GDPR went in, British Airways was fined $250 million for just say 250x, right? And Marriott was fined another $140 million. So just the nature of these fines are consequential to businesses. They are accountable to their stakeholders, to their shareholders about what happens if something like this happens. And I think given the severity of this, businesses can no longer, and what I'm hearing from customers is that they can no longer just let it be and manage that as a risk of doing business or cost of doing business, because these are consequential to their shareholders, and they need to take action.
Cool. So as people are collecting all this data, right, they're building the data lake with this data. What makes complying with these privacy regulation a challenge for a data lake?
So I'd like to take the first stab at that. I think that everybody today has heard about a data lake, but I'm not sure that everybody fully understands what that is. It is a very large, unstructured data pond, if you will, or ocean, where data can come in from multiple sources and does come in from multiple sources. And the fact that it's unstructured, you don't know where and what is in that data lake per se until you do some processing. So with data lakes, the most important thing is really understanding how data is getting in and being pulled out of the data lake, data inventory, how are you processing data, how are you collecting the data, because then you'll at least know the types of data that be in there. With these regulations, which are consumer privacy focused, it's all about the PII data. So you need to be able to map out where this data is in your data lake. so that when you are requested to update or erase data per the various regulations, each of them have different stipulations around this. You have to be able to know what's there so that you can address that quickly, because each of these regulations also put timelines around how quickly you have to respond to them.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. No, certainly. I think that's what I think. As Drew said, I think the problem is, is compounded with the aspect of data volume being so high. The velocity at which data is being produced is very high, and the variety of data. Right. Just looking at all that, I think it becomes a big challenge for customers. So when I spoke to customer, they mentioned, a lot of the data, some of it is managed. They control what data comes in. Maybe they have some controls around data management. But a vast amount of the data gets into the lake in an unmanaged way. So users are bringing in data from whatever source may be, and without necessarily realizing, whether that data constitutes something that might fall under with some of these regulations, and then it becomes consequential of non-management. And especially if data comes in an unmanaged way, you run the risk of data quality, right? So you have data being, in there which doesn't necessarily clearly articulate whether or not it falls within these controls. And then adding to that, as data comes in, there's a lot of data replication. There's a lot of data for collaborative use cases, data sharing as well. So you have a constant process of data redundancy and with collaboration, data proliferation as well. So not having the right controls in place just exacerbates the problem, because you really no longer have visibility into what data is in your lake, unless you take proactive action to classify and curate your data, and then uptaking the appropriate remediation measures that can work across scale, right across the use cases without disrupting your data lake, which really confounds the problem.
And the other thing to really understand is the enormous volumes we're talking about. We have customers that process petabytes a day. And we have customers that receive, terabytes or greater a day in terms of new volume of data. So, the volume is just getting bigger and bigger. When I joined Qubole 4 years ago, we were talking, sub petabytes in processing, and now we're talking multitudes of petabytes in processing on a single day of new data. And that level of volume, without these processes and having a good understanding of the inventories, you're never going to be able to address these regulations in the intent that would keep, the enforcement actions at a minimum.
So how do you go about addressing these challenges? I've heard about the volume, I have heard about the velocity, I have heard about the type, the format, right? I have heard about the penalties, everything. But what are the things, Drew, first to you as a CISO of a responsible organization where you are getting so much of data and you are made responsible to make sure that the compliance happens for that, keeping that customer trust in place? How do you make sure what are the things you do basically to make it happen?
So I think, as you mentioned, it really falls into two different categories. There's the stuff that my team does as part of their daily activities, and the ramp up that we did to GDPR and to CCPA. And a lot of that is process driven stuff. It is, figuring out the data inventory, the ins and outs, where the data lives, is the data being copied? You tend to find that the data, there's many working sets as people are trying to analyze the data and figure out things to help them do a better job for our consumers. That you need to make sure that your process is dealing with that, as well as backups of the data. I think the other thing is that you need to spend, or what I have my team do, is spend time going through what we call tabletop exercises. What happens when this event happens? What happens when we get a consumer request for erasure? What happens when we get a consumer request for a data update? What's the process we would follow so that when those requests do come in, it's not we're scrambling to figure it out. It's we already know how we respond to that, and we've got an ordered set of tasks. We know who needs to get involved, so that we can meet the timelines for that. I think the second thing, which Akil can cover, is the product features and capabilities that you need to have when you offer a platform or as a service. So I'll let him talk about that.
Certainly, I think just to kind of TR form and Drew mentioned, I think largely some of the processes and changes that Drew talked about is having the privacy first approach, right? I think you need to have that across your mindset so that any user who's going to either be producing data, collaborating with another user knows, right? He takes into account, what I need to do about this data. Is there something I can share? What are the rules I need to follow? Mainly to address these requirements. Secondly, I think in terms of the product ask, it kind of comes down to knowing. It kind of comes down to knowing what these regulations mean. There are a few additional requirements that these privacy regulations require. One is around these data subjects, right? One is the thing to provide transparency into data you collect, and that's what Drew mentioned. I need to have a mechanism where I can inventory all my data, so I know where an individual's data is. If I go to a business and say, "Oh, do you know where my data is?" So then I'm a customer of your business. Can you tell me where all the data is? Most customers don't know where to start, right? They really can't be assured that they are able to articulate where exactly all my data is across all systems. And number two, there are certain actions that need to take. So one is the right to rectify, which is the ability to ensure that I can update the data and be able to do that within the SLA that Drew mentioned. And the other option is to delete the data. I think when you work with things on the data lake, you assume the data can stay there forever. But now with requirements like the right to be forgotten or right to erasure, you need to have capabilities there. So product now, in terms of when you leverage a data lake platform, needs to offer capabilities that can offer that at scale. Because we talked about velocity, variety, and the volume of data. You can no longer do things that take days or weeks. You may have to do things within a few hours and finding the right technology. So there are a few things that each of your cloud vendors or your cloud data platforms are trying to find better ways of doing it. So me as a product manager, I've looked at providing transactionality in the lake as an example to help you with the right to rectify or right to be forgotten, providing a better mechanism to apply the principle of least privilege. So you're able to reduce the exposure of your sensitive data or your users' private data across users. So the right people have access to the right data only for the right period of time, so they no longer can go and look up, anybody's information, in the data lake.
And education is key. I mean, we spend a lot of time not only educating our consumers and customers and prospects, because they often come to us and ask questions about this, but we also have to educate all of the employees at Qubole globally to make sure that they understand what their responsibilities are, because I've always believed security is part of everyone's responsibility at a company. So they have to understand why it's important, what it's for, and what they need to do when they're asked to address these concerns.
Yeah. And one of the things I just want to add is that I think the other thing I've heard from customers is this trend towards data minimization. So you actually question what data you're collecting. Do you really need to collect that information? Because oftentimes customers, when they put together the data platform, why not collect all the information we can about the user? We don't know how we're going to use it. Maybe it'll be useful in the future because the guys who are collecting the information are building it without knowing what the future consumption pattern might be. So, but now you're reevaluating it. Like, what's the real purpose? Is there a higher cost for me to maintain this information, not just a storage cost or compute cost, but rather the financial cost, the liability cost of having that information exposed, things of that nature. So you actually have this trend called data minimization. So you really reduce the scope of data that you're collecting, not more than what you need to run your business or to create value for your customers.
And there's actually parts of the regulation that talk about that you need to have a definitive purpose for the data that you're collecting. If you're collecting, I've definitely seen that, at many companies where, well, I may be able to use that data in the future for another purpose. Well, those things are restricted in some of these regulations, where you need to have a definitive purpose today of how you're going to use the data. If you need different data in the future, then you have to ask for that data then. You can't ask for all the data up front just with the hope that you might need the data down the road.
That's an interesting point. I haven't heard about it much or have not seen much in the literature industry-wide. So that's the first time I'm hearing. So thanks for sharing. So let me pause here. And people who are listening or who are basically attending this live session right now, feel free to put in your questions, because as I'm going through these questions, I want to make it more of like answering your specific questions or your specific topics you have around CCPA and GDPR. So as we move forward, you talked about internally the processes, the employee awareness, putting security first,
Privacy first
principle within the organizations people work with. But It's pretty much open in regards to that. You work with a lot of technology vendors, you work with a lot of partners, you have cloud services which you're using to build your products and everything. What are your expectations from the people who come and talk to you about, like, okay, use our product so, and then how do you categorize it from that privacy first principle? And then what questions should people who are interacting with these cloud technology partners, what should they ask them or look for?
I think that's a very big question. In today's age, I think that there's a lot of dependency on things like the shared responsibility model, where everybody from the cloud vendor and the service or platform like Qubole and the consumer or customer have responsibilities to meet different things of the regulation. And I think the key is that you need to ask your vendors, as a customer looking for a platform for your use, is what exactly do you do to help me solve this problem? Because if you're buying a service or a platform, there has to be some services or some tools or some capabilities that they offer that will help me meet my burden as a data controller. So I think that's part one, and I think Akil can go into a little bit of that stuff, some of the things that he's been researching and talking about. In the data lake space, there are some emerging technologies to deal with this, but it is still a difficult problem to solve because of these large unstructured data that could be petabytes in size.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. And I think when you look at the challenges that you're going to face in the data lake, I think one thing you need to be cognizant of, that when these privacy regulations were enacted, they were not meant to be for a data lake or for a data store. They were meant to be in terms of, okay, what we need to do as a part of business of data collection, affording data subjects the rights, or the individuals the rights to the data that's being collected about them. What that basically means that there is no prescribed solution for it. It doesn't say use this and life is great. So there is no silver bullet when you go to a cloud platform saying, do you have a GDPR solution? Right? That's not the way it operates. Largely, it's a combination of different controls that you need to enforce. So obviously, having firstly an understanding of what these privacy regulations mean for your individual businesses come in. So when I've spoken to customers, like I said, you ideally start with, okay, how do I catalog and classify my information? So go to the platform vendor or identify solutions that can help you classify information that you're collecting at the scale that you need. Number two is you need to find the right level of controls that you need to do for remediation. There is no one control that you may want to enforce. Like I said, data minimization reduces the scope of things. You may identify that there are certain kinds of data that falls within the scope of GDPR, CCPA, and once you have classified that, you may apply the right levels of controls. Often people start with things like role-based access control. So you want to make sure the principle of least privilege and information security is a prominent requirement. Fundamentally, it just says, I think I mentioned it earlier, giving the right people access to the right data for the right period of time. So as an example, if I contact my cell phone provider, let's say I'm with AT&T, and say, can you help me with an issue? So if the support person has access to my data about everything, he should have access to the data only for the duration of the call or duration of the time he's providing support to me. After that, that right needs to be revoked, right? So you should not be able to look up all my calls throughout, call history throughout the time. So being able to enforce that at scale becomes important. So when somebody's working with the data, for the duration of the time they are working with the data, they have access to the sets of data and nothing more. And to enforce that, one is role-based access controls. The second thing is you need to apply granular security. So what you've seen is customers switch from, okay, I have given you access to the entire database of systems. Just imagine if you have access to all of Uber's database, right? You have access to all where anybody has moved from point A to point B if everybody is using Uber. And how do you make sure there's right privacy controls in there, right? With shared, in an ecosystem where we're sharing a lot more data, it becomes really important that I apply fine-grained access controls. So ask your vendor about tools like whether that's an open source solution, or if you are already invested in a access control solution for your non-data lake, see if that's applicable. But more often than not, customers want something that's scalable, so something that's purpose-built. So you can look at things like Ranger, things of that nature, to help you address a solution. Now, once you have access controls, you need to find a mechanism to address things like we talked about the right to erasure or right to be forgotten. To do things like that, historically, the way you could do it is you can just drop tables. But just imagine you've identified my record in hundreds of tables in different sources. you need to be able to delete that data. How do you find a good way to identify my record and being able to do it at scale, right? So you need to be able to do that, in an efficient manner. So transactionality becomes really important as well. So I would definitely recommend that, exploring each of these privacy regulations and finding ways to, talking to your vendor or finding ways to address them in your environment.
And I think some of the things that Akil mentioned, I mean, privilege minimization, not granting too many people access to the data, that helps with the proliferation, which from a challenge of, updating and erasing the data, you want to limit the proliferation of the data because there's chances that you might miss some of the data. And what we found is that the more people have access to data, the harder it becomes to control that data. So you want to make sure that anybody that has access to the data has the education, has the job requirement to that data. Because what tends to happen when somebody has access to the data that doesn't need to have access to the data, maybe they make a copy of the data and they never touch that data, for weeks or months because they don't really need it on their daily jobs. And therefore it becomes stale, and then you have a bigger problem in trying to make sure that your data inventories are accurate and up to date.
Okay. And just adding to that, one other point is, the whole idea of privilege. The number one reason for data breaches is about lost credentials or lost privileges. So just imagine if you restrict the scope of data that you have access to, and if those credentials gets exposed, the scope is also reduced. So again, it's all about risk management and risk reduction, and requirements such as this are going to help in that regard.
Yeah. So if I recollect like what you guys have said, one is the data minimization. The other part is role-based access controls, like more tighter on that one. Granular data access controls there, and then granular data read and writes, right? So those are the things you have talked about.
And the ability to, update the data, find out where the data is, things like that. So,
cool. And obviously, to demonstrate this, finally, you need the audit and compliance. So you want to make sure you have mechanisms in place that can, either it's for proactive auditing of, when people have access, what's going on, can do things like anomaly detection or e-discovery, right? Making sure you're able to demonstrate compliance with an auditor if required.
Cool. So this leads into this thing, like if you do all this, is there a way to be certified? Like there has been a question which has been asked in the webinar. Is there a way that a person or an organization be compliant with GDPR or CCPA, like a certification process? Like people get certification for CIPA, SOC 2 and all that. So they are thinking about like, is there anything like that for CCPA or GDPR?
So there's no real certifications today because they're relatively new regulations. That will come at some point where that there'll be mechanisms to at least demonstrate your compliance. Frameworks and things like that still need to evolve a little bit more. There are tools and services out there today, mostly around GDPR today, but where it can help you comply with the various articles where you have to do reporting based on your size and your number of records and things like that. And there is a lot of consultants and toolkits out there that you can use to help with that. And that's still an evolving space. But as these regulations continue to adapt and change, what we tend to find is that over time, there's still refinements to these things. And it's still a work in progress. I mean, today there's GDPR, which is European based, and there's CCPA, which is California, which frankly ends up covering most companies that are providing any kind of service because you just can't know where your consumers are. But there are more regulations coming, and I think as those things continue to flush out in more states and more areas, governments and countries start having more privacy regulations, that there's definitely a market for this, that there will be, like I said, I don't know if there'll be a certification per se, but there will be compliance regiments and companies that sell services to help you ease the burden.
Cool. So I have a couple of other questions here. The first question, I don't know if it is targeted towards you, Drew, or Akil.
Throw it out there. Let's see.
Yeah, so let's go
It's
with Drew
difficult as
first.
Drew is.
Yeah, so let's start with Drew. So do you delete logs as well when you delete the consumer data? How do you handle logs?
So logs are typically transactional based, and I think that if they do contain PII data, they do contain information about the consumer, which, especially in the case of GDPR, some of them do, because things like IP address and geographic locations count towards that PII data, that personalization data. Yeah, you've got to be able to delete it or update it, or anonymize that data so that it's no longer linked to an individual, especially if that individual has requested either erasure or update of that data. I think the more important strategy that we are trying to get around, and I think is my recommendation, is more data age, to make sure that data has a life cycle. So that when it no longer has a useful purpose, and this is even stipulated in some of the regulations, that you age that data out so that you no longer have the data, so that you don't have that problem. I think most consumers will be focused more on the information that directly affects them, which I think IP addresses and things like that probably aren't at the top of that list. But if there is a request for erasure or a request for an update that does address that, which we've seen in some of the search engine cases that have happened with GDPR, then yeah, there has to be a way to search out that data and delete it. And that needs to cover logs as well. I mean, these regulations are not meant to address only a certain type of data in a certain location. They're really focused on just that type of data, wherever that data may be. And it can end up in logs. I mean, I've seen customers who put, a lot of verbose information in logs that can include usernames and email addresses and things like that. So that all has to be addressed. And that was one of the lead ups that we did is we went out and we did that data inventory and we figured out where that data was. And we asked a lot of hard questions. Do we really need that data there? And we changed our product in many fundamental ways to collect that data differently, or not to collect the data or store that data in certain places, because we weren't sure that there was any definitive value to the company to that. And that happens in logs. Logs, as I said, are very transactional. And they're really good for trying to figure things out in the moment, like if someone's having an issue with the service or the platform. But 6 months from now, is that log data still relevant? So the key there is that data minimization and data aging, to make sure that you get rid of that data and remove it from your inventories.
Right, and I think that's largely what I've heard from other customers as well. I think aging or life cycle, the data life cycle becomes really important, both from a cost standpoint, because you're storing so much data, not just storing it, then processing all that data. That's what kind of comes down to. So you proactively want to manage that, and in some cases, customers have even done more proactive about it. So businesses have done mechanisms where they give an option for the customer to consent. I'm going to collect your data for 6 months, 3 months, a year. As an example, you go to YouTube, and I don't know how many of the consumers use YouTube today. I assume everybody, but you have a choice to say that the information it's collecting about you is preserved for 3 months, and it automatically deletes. So you have a choice, and some businesses are proactively doing it to manage their own thing, and as I said, the value of data sometimes goes down as it ages as well. So there's more reason to reduce the amount of data you're collecting if it doesn't serve a purpose, besides things like troubleshooting and e-discovery purposes where you need to maintain some data history.
Cat videos on YouTube. That's the way to go.
Yes.
Any comments from the platform, like Qubole platform perspective, on the handling of the logs?
Yeah, I think that's largely kind of alluding to what Drew kind of mentioned. I think one thing is we want to make sure there are requirements for compliance where we need to maintain a level of logs. So things like admin action, right? If you want to go back to who made some changes to privileges and settings, that largely are things that are more systemic and more for e-discovery purposes. Those things will be retained for a longer period of time. But if there is information about users, about making certain data, in the standpoint of Qubole leveraging our platform, largely customers are finding ways to run deletion of some of these logs at a periodic basis. So they have jobs, or Qubole provides capabilities where you can delete these logs after a periodic amount of time to reduce the exposure of the data to the users that will be leveraging the platform. So,
yeah, like I mentioned, I mean, a lot of the log data is transactional. I mean, in Qubole's case, when you're running a command or a query across the system, tons of logs are generated, primarily showing you the interaction between the controller and the workers that are doing the processing, and the success, and any errors in the jobs. And that stuff doesn't really have any long-term value. So data aging is extremely important. But as Akil mentioned, and one of the things that you have to be careful of, or I have to be careful as CSO, is that some of these things, like you mentioned, admin actions, who invited, when people joined, what actions did they perform. There are requirements that I have to keep that data for a much longer period of time. So we have to be able to filter out that data and store that data so that we can keep track of it over a longer period of time. Because it could be years down the road where someone may come and say, prove to me that this happened, at this time. Some of that is financial regulation. Some of that is other government regulations that are not privacy focused, that are focused on the accountability of actions.
Okay. Another question, how important is it for organizations to have a single source of truth in their data lake to truly manage CCPA and GDPR regulations effectively and accurately?
Well, again, I think, I don't know if I'd call it a single source of truth. Again, data lakes are unstructured data, but a data inventory of how that data is getting in and where it's being processed and stored and how it's being used, and something that you update on a very regular basis. One of the things that I push one of my teams to do is that every few months we go through this data inventory exercise and try and figure out if there have been any changes. Because you don't do that activity once. This is something that, as the business evolves, you've got to continue to look at how the data is being collected, what's being collected, where it's being stored, how it's being used, and who's using it. So you've got to have that constant vigilance around making sure that when you know where the data is and how it's being processed, that you keep updating that and looking at, has that changed in the last 6 months? Because inevitably it will have changed. There's no doubt that as your business continues to evolve and services change and improve, that the data that you're collecting is going to be different 6 months from now.
Yeah, and I would second that. I think the main thing here is nothing is constant. Everything is changing. I think one is the data collection, obviously collecting more data, different types of data than before. The processes that you have in place for how data is consumed is changing. Your blueprint of what kind of data constitutes based on these privacy regulations might keep changing as well. So you have to be really mindful of all this, and having an audit or a mechanism to do it every 3 months, 6 months, 9 months may not be enough, right? You may be able to. You want a mechanism where you want to monitor. You have a mechanism to monitor it. So proactively finding mechanisms and process in place that will give you a near real time, snapshot of where things are when you need it, and not wait for weeks and months and hours. Weeks and months and years for you to get this done. You need to have something in place right away. So having a single source of truth versus having a source of truth is important. And I think something that can get you started. I think I would definitely recommend, again, prioritize where the biggest risks are and get started taking some action.
And the other thing I would say about that is, especially with the large volumes of data that we've talked about, I think that having a process for continuous improvement and continuous auditing of these things to make sure that you're still following and things are not drifting is extremely important. What I've found over the years working in security is you can have the best process, but if you're not continuing to test and evaluate those processes, they can still be difficult to implement, still difficult to do when you come about doing them. So if you do something only once a year, it's going to be a difficult exercise every year. But if you take that and you break it down into 3-month steps, then it becomes a little bit more manageable and not quite as daunting.
There's another question, and this goes with the data aging thing. Are there any automated tools to allow data aging related removals from data lake and from online logs and backup data and logs?
So I think there there's certainly some tools that are evolving. In our own use case, we have the ability through queries and commands to look at the age of the data by when it was collected and where it's stored and the last time it was accessed and processed. So we look at, and we tend to write a lot of custom automation using the Qubole platform to be able to find that data and age it out. But I think that depending on what you're processing and where you're doing it. I mean, with logs, the way we've done it is how we collect the logs. We truncate the logs and we store them on a daily basis, so we can just basically delete them from based on how old they are. As a cloud platform, we definitely leverage the tools of the cloud. So we have policies set up to do Glacier backups and then delete from Glacier after a period of time. And I think that it's a multi-discipline kind of approach. You've got to take some of the queries and some of the processes you build. You've got to take some of the tools and capabilities of the platform and the environment you're in. If you're in a cloud provider, they've got some tools. If you're using a platform like Qubole, they've got some tools. But it's the most important thing, and I mentioned this to you guys when we talked about this last week, is I think one of the things that's really important that I've seen is that it is not something that you push the easy button and you move on. Everybody, and that's part of that shared responsibility model that we mentioned earlier. You have to depend on your cloud vendors. You have to depend on your platform like Qubole to help you with it, but you still have to configure and you still have to go through the motions to make sure that you're doing the right things for that data, because just having the tools, just because you're in the cloud or just because you're using Qubole or another platform, that doesn't solve the problem. That just provides you the mechanism, the tools, and the capabilities to solve the problem. You still have to do some of the groundwork to make sure it's being done. And most importantly, and Akil and I see this all the time, is ask. I mean, talk to your cloud providers, talk to your platform providers like Qubole. We do customer advisory and we do conversations with customers all the time. That's the opportunity to ask. I mean, those questions not only allow us to impart what knowledge we have to you to help you get better, because we want to help you as well. But it also gives us an opportunity by hearing the challenges that our consumers and our customers are facing of developing new tools and capabilities for them. A lot of the stuff that we've done in terms of Ranger and ACID and role-based access control, we've done as through collaboration with the customer.
Okay, got it. So a couple of other questions. First is, do you have good examples of how to prove completion of a deletion request?
That's very tricky because, again, if you don't have a good data inventory or a data mapping of where the data lives, how do you prove a negative? You don't know. If you don't know where that data is, then you can't prove that it's been deleted because it could be somewhere that you don't know. Typically, what we do when we receive a request is like I said, we've done these data inventories, we've done these data mappings, and then we run a series of scripts to be able to erase or update the data. And then we produce, kind of a summary output of those scripts and those run attempts to let customers know if they want a full record of what we've done. But to some degree, and I think this comes in a multitude of ways, there has to be a trust relationship between the customer and Qubole, or the Qubole or the customer and the platform that they're using. What we've found is that through third-party attestations like SOC 2 and doing certifications like ISO 27001 and 27017 and 18, that it's really important that we demonstrate that we take this serious by doing these attestations and certifications on an annual basis. And not everybody does. And part of that is to help customers feel that they can trust that when we say we've done something, that we do it. But there is a lot of trust in this because and that's where some of these laws come into place as well around transparency, so that you know where your data lives. Because if you don't know where the data lives, then how can you ever get to a point where you say you've deleted it?
Right. I think certainly. I think that's why I think to build this trust, I think you need to be able to kind of work in a very transparent way with the customer, right? And as Drew pointed out, I think having an inventory, not just of data, I think that's one of the processes, and also when you talk about this privacy first mentality, you know that people are going to follow the process. If people are not going to follow the process, then you basically run the risk of copies of data or things of that nature that you think are no longer to be covered by your regulations if they're not deleted. So I've seen customers obviously do the inventory process to identify what tables, what databases or what files contain the sensitive information, and then operationalizing process for deletion. But lastly, it's not as simple as that as well. So let's say you have a table that has multiple records of the same first name, right? How do you, or first name and last name, but the address may be different. So how do you account for the probability of that's the right record that I'm going and deleting? So this problem can be confounded. So I think that's why when you talk about transparency, setting the right expectation. So when you set the expectation that I've deleted your record, you're able to transparently set the expectation of the customer that I've deleted these records, and you have visibility. You're able to demonstrate I've deleted your record in these systems, right? And prior to that, you have consent management. So you're actually proactively saying, I'm collecting this data about you. So when you go about deleting, you know what data I'm deleting. I'm going to delete about the customer. So once you build that level of transparency with the customer, it definitely helps the customer build that trust with you, right? And then you're able to do this at scale, right? When customers ask for something, they're able to achieve that from your, and obviously will drive more value for your customers as well.
And I think another thing, again, in my shoes, if there's anybody on the webinar who is heading a security program or in the security team, is making sure that there's good alignment with the organization, that the security team or the privacy team has the authority to enforce getting these things done. A lot of security teams struggle with having the right visibility and the right support in the organization. And one of the things that I do, reporting to the CEO and being on our executive staff, is on a regular basis, at least once every 3 months, I update the entire management team on how we're doing. So having KPIs and being able to report where we're finding things are drifting in an unacceptable way or an unacceptable manner is really important, so that they understand that should we have an event, this would be likely to lead to a negative business outcome. So I spend a lot of time with the management team and the company as a whole to make sure that I'm transparent around what we're looking for and what I'm looking at as an executive in security. And my weekly one-on-ones with my CEO, I explain to him, how I came up with these KPIs, and there are KPIs, key measurement indicators, where it's talking about privacy and how we're controlling the privacy and consumer choice.
Cool. So a couple of other questions. There are plenty of them now. So what about worker PII? When a person inside the company enters data, captures user IDs, based on GDPR, would this be considered sensitive data? And should this data have tighter access controls than non-PII data?
Can you say that again?
Sure. So what about worker PII? When a person inside the company enters the data, captures user IDs, everything. So it's the person who is
like an employee of a company.
Employee of a company, right? Based on GDPR, would this be considered sensitive data?
I think yes. With GDPR, there are some clauses around proper business justification for the collection of the data. But if you're collecting, say, first and last name and a place of business work address, not a personal address. I mean, the way GDPR is designed, it would still be technically considered that kind of data, but you do have to take into consideration whose data is that really. Obviously, the name is the person's identity, so it certainly is. But their email address and their place of business, that really is the identity of the business. There has to be a relationship going back to that shared responsibility model. We have seen requests that have come in from former employees of our customers asking for either an update or a delete of their data. And there has to be a conversation with the customer itself because some of the data is proprietary rights of that business.
Oh, interesting.
So the business itself has to have a say in that. Often when we get those requests, we first let the business know that we received that request because they are the one that has the relationship. So in that particular aspect, Qubole is just the data processor and the data controller is the customer. And it's the customer's responsibility to address that as the data controller, not Qubole's. But if the customer is no longer with us or they ignore the request, then we proactively take it on ourselves to address that request because I do not believe in letting these requests get abandoned. So if we don't get the proper response from the customer, then we let the customer know that we're going to address this with the data that we have. But again, this is just one source out of many of the data that consumer has in various platforms. That's why it's really important, the relationship we have with our customers, the data controller, because they're going to have data on that person far beyond what they have in the Qubole platform. So it really needs to be addressed holistically across all of the data that former employer has of that consumer.
Right. Yeah, just I think Drew kind of covered it, but just a couple of points. One is, I think certainly these regulations were initially meant to target individuals who are customers of businesses to protect the data, largely because people are monetizing on the data, and then there was risk with the data breaches that were happening that was compromising the privacy identity of the individual. But certainly, I think just the way these regulations are going, giving individuals rights to the data, right? You already have that with PII, PCI, PHI. It becomes more important. I think Europe is usually a place where these standards come in first before it kind of goes broadly. So I think I'll continue to monitor enforcement of this. I think it'll become really important to see individuals are also asking for these things. So already in Europe, there are things like workers' council, things of that nature that give individual rights. So anticipate that is becoming more prominent. The one other point I would say is that, if you think about information that you're kind of sharing, right? You may have within your company, you may have, let's say, a flu clinic or whatever, and they say, okay, if you decide to log in, you need to use your username and your social security number, and that's now shared with the third party. So now it becomes important that you're sharing information with the third party provider as well. So I think with the privacy first mindset, I would definitely encourage customers to always think about privacy, irrespective of whether that's your own employee data or customers. I think customers are what's going to get more attention right now, but have a privacy first about any data that's being collected, right? You're already doing it probably today. Keep expanding on that as you look at new data initiatives.
Okay. And I think the other thing to think about with this is these things are still evolving as regulations. If you go back to the last major initiative, before GDPR, there was, EU data directives. And it took, basically 20 years for those data directives to really evolve and proper precedents be set with them. And I think here in California, same thing happened. Almost 20 years ago, you had CA 1386, which was an early privacy consumer rights protection. And within a few years, you had 46 or 45 states that also had different regulations, some of them based off California's law, some of them not. And I think you're going to continue to see that. GDPR is about to hit its 2-year birthday in a couple months here. And it was something that was, envisioned and was being built over several years, like 6 or 7 years. So you're going to continue to see these things evolve and grow. The biggest thing is the precedence. As we see enforcement actions happen, that we get clarity on this. As Akil mentioned early on, a lot of these things are not prescriptive in terms of doing exactly this thing. They're more generalized because if they make something very prescriptive, then it ends up leading to a lot of loopholes.
Exactly. So I have two more questions. Let's pick the first one, which goes in regards to most probably companies which deal with data located in multiple countries. Like, how about CCP and GDPR compliance responsibility for the companies located in other countries or offshore call center, which where the enforcement might not be that strict? Do you see privacy data breaches and penalties force these companies to move offshore data access back to US? So the thing is, yeah.
Well, I think there's a couple things to think there. It is not about where you're storing the data or where you're processing the data. In both CCPA and GDPR, it is where is the person who is accessing the services residing. So if they are in Europe, even if all of your business and all of your processing happens outside of Europe, you're still on the hook because the consumer's there. And I think the other thing to think about, at least the thing I've had to think about, is that it is very hard to say with absolute certainty that I do or don't have a customer in a particular region or geography. As a SaaS, as an internet SaaS provider of a platform, consumers can sign up for anywhere. I mean, we've again through using Qubole ourselves, we know that we have consumers in over 100 countries, and that's not likely to change, and we're going to continue to see that. So I think that regardless of where you're storing the data, where you're processing data, it's where your consumers reside. And like I said, we're going to see more of this. I mean, not only are there currently, I think, 11 states considering privacy regulations, which may or may not be compatible or similar to CCPA. There are also several countries, like I was having a conversation with a customer about some Indian regulations that are being considered right now. So there's going to be a lot more of this. So I think that you have to start right now. If you haven't already started, you should have started before. But if you haven't started, you need to start having a privacy program and privacy first in your privacy program. And you need to be thinking about these concepts very, very soon, because this is going to continue to be a challenge. It's not going to go away.
Cool. Another question. Are there any tiers on how restrictive GDPR is when it comes to medical data, like MRI data or EHR data?
So, I mean, there are obviously in the U.S. Things that deal with that, HIPAA, high-tech, the omnibus rule. Though GDPR really, I mean, there is different classes of data in GDPR. Since it's not a category of data that we collect, I'm not familiar completely with that part of the regulation, but I do know that there are different classes of data where some data is more sensitive than others. So that would be something that you'd have to look into. Again, like I said, there's 99 different articles. I'm sure there's one that addresses that. So I would suggest that you look it up. I'm happy to take questions after this if
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, I think one example, one story I have from a customer is that there's a customer who thought GDPR didn't affect them because they didn't have to deal with GDPR and they didn't have a head start, so just like ignored it for a while, and then CCPA is going to impact them. So they felt it would have been great if GDPR impacted us, or at least we planned for it. So whether that's healthcare data or any kind of data, I think look for regulations that are recommended practices around privacy, whether that applies to you or not, because it's always good if you can, obviously you may prioritize that in your investments, but make sure you are able to proactively think about them and see how you can have the privacy first mentality applied to your environment. So,
So guys, I think so we are getting more questions, but we are running against the time now for the webinar. So
Sounds like we have another webinar planned.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. That's what I was going to say. So please let us let the questions keep coming to us. We will definitely address them in one form or fashion by contacting you or doing another webinar series. We are seeing already like 4 or 5 questions as people want to dig more and know more. So thank you, Drew, Akil, for your time. I hope this has been a valuable webinar for the audience who has been listening to this one or the ones who will listen it to the later. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.